What you just heard there was a little piece of Otis Spann, who is considered one of the greatest blues pianists that ever lived. That music is fitting because we are going to be talking in this video about James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues. And blues music plays a major role in Sonny's Blues, as you might can imagine by the title. So, kind of wanted you to get a taste of what blues music sounds like. And when you go and look at the polls of who the best blues pianists that ever lived were, Otis Spann frequently comes up. He was started off as the pianist in Muddy Waters Band, and he ended up branching out on his own eventually. All right. So, Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. James Baldwin is probably one of the most important African-American authors in American history. He was born during something known as the Harlem Renaissance, but of course he was too young to understand what that was. But by the time he got old enough to write in the late 40s and early 50s, he was very keenly aware of the racial tensions going on in the United States, and particularly in his home of Harlem. And so that's why Sonny's Blues takes place in Harlem. He was so bothered by the racism in the United States that he would eventually move to France, and he would end up living a good chunk of his life in France and would eventually end up dying there. So that kind of gives you an idea of Baldwin's attitudes towards the racial tensions that were going on in the United States at the time. All right, so let's talk about Sonny's Blues. And what I want to do is I want to talk about several themes, because this is probably, depending on what semester you're in, probably going to be the longest story that I'm having you read. But I think it's a very, very good story, and one that's certainly worth reading. So what I want to do is go ahead and go in here, and there's a slideshow in your D2L page, and it's either going to be it's going to be one called titled James Baldwin, or if you're in like a half term or if you're in a summer term, it could be a slideshow in the prose essay folder that's got all of the stories all in one slideshow. So probably a good way to do that is to follow along with that and then to grab your textbook. This is the textbook that we're using during the semester that I'm recording this video. So if we're still in that textbook, then you can turn right to the pages. If not, then I'll have to give you some approximations. All right. If you want to open that slideshow, by the way, I'll go ahead and hit the pause button and go ahead and open it up. All right. So we'll skip the biographical information in the slideshow. We'll go right to imprisonment as a theme. There are several themes that are very, very evident in this story, and imprisonment is one of them. And of course, not just because Sonny is in prison as a result of some bad decisions that he has made early in life, but then of course he gets out, and that's why the story takes place. But there's some other imprisonments as well, and one of them is this kind of social imprisonment. And you'll notice on this same slide you got social status as a theme. There's going to be a lot of overlap between these themes as I go through them. So let's go. This is right after Sonny has gotten out of prison, and he is riding home with his brother. And this is in this book, page 37. Okay. So remember, they're in a taxi cab and they're riding back, and they've got the park on one side and they've got buildings on the other. In fact, it says here, the lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings. Let's read that paragraph for a little bit. So we drove along between the green... By the way, this is 37 in this book, if you're in this book. So we drove along between the green of the park and the stony, lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings toward the vivid, killing streets of our childhood. These streets hadn't changed, though housing projects jutted up out of them now like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea. So you've got these buildings that are pretty much made of concrete or whatever that are sticking up out of, from between the streets. And he's likening this to rocks in a boiling sea. There's turmoil in that sea. There's all kinds of, it's not calm in the least. And these buildings are like that on the not so calm streets. Most of the houses in which we had grown up had vanished, as had the stores from which we had stolen. So here's our narrator, who's actually an English teacher in high school, admitting to the fact that he was a shoplifter as a kid. All right. The basements in which we had first tried sex, the rooftops from which we had hurled in tin cans and bricks, but houses exactly like the houses of our past yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys we had once been found themselves smothering in these homes, came down into the streets for light and air, and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. And even goes so far as to say those who got out always left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg to leave it in a trap. So, there's a bit of an imprisonment there in the neighborhood. And even our narrator, who's a high school teacher, who could teach high school anywhere, stays home and teaches high school in Harlem, where he's teaching boys that are exactly like he and his brother were back when they were in high school. So, the impossibility of escape is a common theme throughout this story. All right. Social status as a theme. Our brother, or the older brother, who's the narrator here, really looks down upon Sonny because Sonny doesn't have a job. He thinks because he got an education and he got a job as a high school English teacher that he's of a better social status than Sonny is. He doesn't understand that Sonny needs music. Sonny must play music. So, there's that bit of snobbishness going on there. And racism plays a little bit in this social status thing as well. Now, race is kind of an undercurrent bubbling underneath the entire story. Say, for example, the blues being a specifically African-American music. But there's really one place in this story that I can think of where racism is so evident. And that involves Sonny and the narrator's uncle, which occurs somewhere around in this book, page, let me see, I got it marked somewhere. Around the bottom of page 40, the top of page 41. So the mom reveals to the narrator, after the narrator's already an adult, that he had an uncle who was his father's brother. Our narrator had no idea of this. And what happens here is that this kid, he actually had a decent job, but he loved to play the guitar, and he and the narrator's father, who is his brother, of course, are walking down the street, and these drunken white guys decide that it would be fun to run over this black man with a guitar. And it is described in great detail. So he went, and he urinated under a tree. He comes back out. You heard a car motor, in that same minute, your brother stepped out from behind the tree in the road and in the moonlight. So he was in the darkness of off the road. Dark and light is going to be a major theme throughout this story. Steps out to the road. He had started to cross the road, and your father started to run down the hill. He says he doesn't know why. The car was full of white men. They was all drunk. And when they seen your father's brother, they let out a great whoop and holler, and they aimed the car straight at him. They was having fun. They just wanted to scare him the way they do sometimes, But they was drunk, and I guess the boy, being drunk too, was scared, kind of lost his mind. By the time he jumped, it was too late. And then, of course, he goes into graphic detail about what happened to the brother. So there's the racial social status, but there's also the economic social status. It's one that the narrator says that you really can't improve. At least, he has that pessimistic idea that there's no way you can improve social status no matter what you try to do. All right, the next theme we're going to talk about is rage and fury. And this story is full of characters that have this rage boiling up inside. And, they need outlets to let it go. And the very first description we get of this is when our narrator's talking about his stories. Page 30 in this book. All right. So, of course, he's talking about his brother. He couldn't believe his brother had gotten popped by the police. And then, so this is very early on in the story, actually, probably the first page of whatever book you're on. And then we get down towards the bottom. I was sure that the first time Sonny had ever had horse, and horse is a slang name for heroin, he couldn't have been much older than these boys were now. He's talking about the students. These boys now were living as we'd been living then. They were growing up with a rush and their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. So it goes back to the social status thing. These boys that are born in Harlem don't really have much of a chance of ever being anything but poor. They were filled with rage. All they really knew were two darknesses. The darknesses of their lives, which was now closing in upon them, and the darkness of the movies, which had blinded them to that other darkness which they now vindictively dreamed at once more together than any other time more alone. So these boys that this teacher is teaching are all full of rage, and our teacher knows it. But what can he do about it? He's trying to educate them, trying to help them. But he knows that only a small number of these boys are ever going to get out of their situation. The other is that Sonny himself is full of rage. And this is on page, I want to say 55. Yes. So page 55 of this book. This is when Sonny has invited the brother to come listen to him play at the club. And his brother's trying to get a grasp, understand why Sonny needs to play music so much. And this is going to be kind of down. Almost at the bottom of 55. So, Sonny confesses that the reason he went to drugs is that he became something he didn't recognize. Okay. And he doesn't want to talk about it. I'm not talking about it now because I feel guilty or something like that. Maybe it'd be better I did. I don't know. Anyway, I can't talk about it, not to you, not to anybody. And now he turned and faced me. And here's what Sonny says next. Sometimes, and it was actually when I was most out of the world, I felt that I was in it. And that I was with it. Really. I could play. I didn't really have to play, but it just came out of me. Actually, that's not the part of it. It's actually... Oh, I'm sorry. It's towards the top of 55. All right. It's terrible sometimes inside, he said. That's what's the trouble. You walk these streets, black and funky and cold, and there's not really a living ass to talk to, and there's nothing shaking, and there's no way of getting it out. That storm inside. You can't talk it, and you can't make love with it, and when you finally try to get with it and play it, you realize nobody's listening. So you've got to listen. You've got to find a way to listen. So there's that storm inside. It's bubbling inside. All that rage, that frustration that's going with him. This, again, the music has to be the outlet. And that other passage that I read, I'll read again in a minute. But that is the theme. What do you do about all that anger building up? Can you do anything about it? All right, the blues is a theme. You just heard a little bit of blues piano. It's a very distinctly African-American type of music. But here's the thing. Sonny doesn't want to play mainstream blues like Louis Armstrong. And for that, we get to... this is after... I want to say right before he goes into the military. Or right before Sonny goes into the military. Let's see. Yeah, this is on page 44 in this one. Towards the bottom. So he basically tells him that, Sonny basically tells our narrator, hey, I want to play music. Are you serious? Hell yes, I'm serious. He looked more helpless than ever and annoyed and deeply hurt. I suggested helpfully, "Oh, you mean like Louis Armstrong?" Now, you have to understand, Louis Armstrong was an African-American musician that was part of the Harlem Renaissance who made it into the mainstream. You've probably heard Louis Armstrong's music on the radio or in a movie or something now. So our narrator thinking, hey, he wants to be a famous musician like the famous Louis Armstrong. And look at what his Sonny's reaction is. His face closed as though I'd struck him. No, I'm not talking about none of that old time down home crap. Well, look, Sonny, I'm sorry I don't get mad. I just don't altogether get it. That's all. Name somebody. You know, a jazz musician you admire. Bird. Who? Bird. Charlie Parker. Don't they teach you nothing in the Army? I've been out of touch, I said. So, basically, the Harlem Renaissance wanted African American musicians to be absorbed in the mainstream and maybe bring about social equality that way. Here, Sonny doesn't want any part of Louis Armstrong, who has been absorbed. You know, people back then were probably thinking of Louis Armstrong as a bit of a sellout, sold his soul to get popular and make lots of money. He was a real jazz musician, like this guy Bird, Charlie Parker. So, there is that whole African American musical genre that Sonny really wants to be a part of that the brother does not understand. All right. Okay. Sonny finds a sense of family with his fellow musicians more than he does with his own brother. His fellow musicians understand him. They get him. They don't judge him because they too need the music to escape. In fact, when he first arrives at the club near the very end of the story, he first gets there. He's talking about Sonny and his fans and his fellow musicians. This is after that little break, about one, and then you got 2, 3, 4, about 5 down, right? 5 paragraphs down, I should say. It turned out that everyone, this is about midway in that big long paragraph, it turned out that everyone at the bar knew Sonny, or almost everyone. Some were musicians working there or nearby not working, some were simply hangers-on, and some were there to hear Sonny play. I was introduced to all of them, and they were all very polite to me. Yes, it was clear that, for them, I was only Sonny's brother. Here, I was in Sonny's world, or rather his kingdom. Here, it was not even a question that his veins bore royal blood. So, Sonny feels much more comfortable in that club because he's accepted. There, he's a bit of type of royalty. And why? Because of his music. Because he is such a good pianist. Whereas he doesn't get that at home. Remember, when he's practicing the piano at home, eventually the narrator and his wife tell him, oh, you're doing it too much, you got to stop. So Sonny has to go to the bar and do it. All right. And he pours his suffering into the piano. Let me, during the moment, the narrator's moment of clarity, if you will. This is almost at the very, very end. And he's talking about the tale of light and darkness, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And this tale, according to that face, so from the very, very end is 1, 2, the third paragraph from the very end is page 60 if you're in this book. And this tale, according to that face, that body, those strong hands on those strings, had another aspect in every country. And a new depth in every generation. Listen, Creole seem to be saying. Listen. Now these are Sonny's blues. He made that little black man on the drums know it and the bright brown man on the horn. Sonny wasn't trying any longer to get, Creole wasn't trying any longer to get Sonny in the water. He was wishing him Godspeed, and then he stepped back very slowly, filling the air with the immense suggestion that Sonny speak for himself. Then they all gathered around Sonny, and Sonny played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say, Amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life. but that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried and it was no longer a lament. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning he had yet to make it ours, how he could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, and we would never grow old until he died. Okay, so his suffering has been poured into that piano, and now that anguish on his face is gone. That piano is his outlet, and it helps him ease that suffering. And because of that, Sonny's pouring his heart into the piano, and the piano is sharing that pain with everybody else. All right, next slide. Light and dark is a theme. You've got the metaphorical light and dark of good and evil, and that is prevalent throughout the story. There's always a mention of the darkness, of the evil, the lightness, of the good. Knowledge, exposed to light or hidden away in the dark. You've got the practical life knowledge of the the uncle who was killed by a bunch of drunken folks in a car. That is not revealed to the narrator till later in his life, because people wanted to keep it in the dark. They wanted to keep it hidden. They did not want it out in the light where it can be examined and where it can be talked about. But you've also got our narrator's a high school educator. He's got some hope. He thinks that he can get these boys to see the light and perhaps escape out of Harlem, even though he knows it's kind of a losing proposition. The setting in the nightclub is very, very dark, and I want to take a look at that for just a minute, because in the next point, of course, is the musicians in the nightclub feel more comfortable in the dark. So we go to the point where they arrive in the club before they get on stage. So it's on page 57 in this book. It's after that little break. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs down after that break. Okay. They were going to play soon. A Creole installed me by myself at a table in a dark corner. So already our narrator has to be put in a dark corner to hear the musicians play. Then I watched them, Creole and the little black man and Sonny, and the others, while they horsed around standing just below the bandstand. The light from the bandstand spilled just a little short of them, and watching them laughing and gesturing and moving about, I had the feeling that they, nevertheless, were being most careful not to step into that circle of light too suddenly. That if they stepped into the light too suddenly, without thinking, they would perish in the flame. So, they're afraid to go into the light. It might destroy them. They might perish like in a flame. So that is part of the darkness and light theme. Then eventually they're going to step into the light. But then look what happens. So they step onto the stage. Sonny's fan club yells to him, fills the brother's heart with pride a little bit. And Sonny, of course, is loving it. Then next paragraph, Creole then went to the bass fiddle, and a lean, very bright-skinned brown man jumped up on the bandstand, picked up his horn. So there they were, and the atmosphere on the bandstand and in the room began to change and tighten. Someone stepped up to the microphone and announced them. Then there were all kinds of murmurs. The people at the bar shushed themselves. The waitress ran around getting the last orders. And the lights on the bandstand, on the quartet, turned to a kind of indigo. And then they all look different there. So even when they're performing on stage, they are not in a harsh spotlight. They are in an indigo blue light, which is almost purplish. Much darker than the average spotlight is. And that is where this band feels most comfortable and where they perform. So light and dark, good and evil, knowledge and no knowledge, and just the escape and the reality. That is part of the light and dark theme. And then finally, and this is probably the most important theme of the story, is suffering and the need to escape from it. Many people in life see life as one problem after another. We're always suffering and we're always in pain and there's always bad things happening. What do we do to escape it? Many people seek escape through chemical means, through drugs or through alcohol. They drink to drown the suffering, or they get high to numb that pain and get that high and get that happiness out of them. And of course, our narrator judges Sonny very much because this is Sonny's method prior to going to prison that he actually deals with the pain. Now, there are other things that people do as well. Some people like to go running or jogging. Some people go to the gym and work out. Some people develop hobbies. It can be collecting something like stamps or coins, or it can be building things. Some people just feel best when they're in a workshop, sawing on that wood and hammering those nails and building things. There are all kinds of ways to escape the suffering in life. A lot of people go to church to escape it. Sonny finds his escape in music. He finds it by playing that piano. And I've got to say that music can be very therapeutic. I can personally say for myself that a lot of times when I feel depressed, I'll go and I'll put on some music and I'll just lose myself in it. And sometimes music can actually sing about the suffering that you're suffering. It can actually have, it's like this artist gets it. This musician gets it. This musician understands the human condition and is singing to that, and I'm connecting with this song for that very reason. This is Sonny's escape now, because he doesn't want to go back to the heroin again. That landed him in jail. Plus, it's probably not a good idea to be high on heroin all the time anyway. So music is a good way to escape. So all humans suffer as part of the human condition. And to talk about that part, this happens during the conversation after Sonny has invited our narrator to come here and play. And this is, in this book, it's going to be on page... here we go. 54, 55. Towards the top of 54. This is, like I said, somewhere about the middle of when the brother has announced, or the brother gets invited by Sonny to hear play. Or is it that, or is it even earlier than that? Okay. Now let's go to page 54. All right. He stood up. So basically, they're talking about suffering a little bit. And Sonny stands up. He stood up and walked to the window. This is towards the top of 54 in this book. And remained silent for a long time. Then he sighed, "Me." And he said, "Then, while I was downstairs before, on my way here, listening to that woman sing." Now remember, the woman that was singing was a part of that little gospel trio or quartet or whatever in the street. Listening to that woman sing, it struck me all of a sudden how much suffering she must have had to go through to sing like that. It's repulsive to think you have to suffer that much. So a lot of people believe that some of the best artists are people who have suffered a lot in life and have used their art as an outlet in order to escape that. And they create great art sometimes because of it. I said, but there's no way not to suffer, is there, Sonny? So here's our narrator getting all philosophical. Look, everybody suffers. There's no way not to suffer. I believe not, he said and smiled. But that's never stopped anyone from trying. He looked at me. Has it? I realized with this mocking look that there stood between us forever, beyond the power of time or forgiveness, the fact that I had held silence so long. What he needed was a human, right? So he keeps going down. No, there's no way not to suffer, but you try all kinds of ways to keep from drowning in it, to keep on top of it, and to make it seem, well, like you. Like you did something all right, and now you're suffering for it. You know? I said nothing. Well, you know, he said impatiently, why do people suffer? Maybe it's better to do something to give it a reason. Any reason. But I just agreed, I said, that there's no way not to suffer. Isn't it better then just to take it? Nobody just takes it, Sonny cried. And that's what I'm telling you. Everybody tries not to. You're just hung up on the way some people try because it's not your way. And then, of course, the conversation keeps going on and on. So there's that whole idea that everybody suffers and everybody looks for some way to not suffer anymore. Some people like to listen to music. Some people like to run, go to the gym, go to church. And some people, bang out music on their instruments. And then some people resort to drugs and alcohol as a way, which is probably the most self-destructive way. All right. So Sonny and the narrator's father drank himself to death. So after the uncle died, Sonny and the narrator's dad actually killed the suffering from having witnessed his brother's death. I mean, imagine witnessing your brother get murdered. That cannot be a good thing. So what does he do? He seeks solace in alcohol until he finally drinks himself to death. All right, so Sonny finds music as another way to ease the pain. We read that passage already. A blues bar allows people on the inside to escape trouble, waiting just outside the store. And this is almost the very, very end of the story. I mean, right at the very end, where our narrator says, let's see, where is it at? This is almost the very last. You got the very last paragraph and then about 3 sentences or so before that. And it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again and felt Isabel's tears again, and I felt my own tears begin to rise. And I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside, and by outside it means outside that bar, as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky. So, this moment that Sonny's going to be on the piano is only a moment for Sonny, and it's only a moment for the narrator. And just outside the door, all that suffering, all that pain, all that hardship is waiting to engulf their world again. So these little escapes don't last very long. They only last for a moment. And so then, of course, the narrator realizes Sonny smokes a piece. So these are some ideas as you think about what to write about in your paper for Sonny's Blues. I think it's a story that really speaks to the human condition and really speaks to the human need to do what we can in order to escape suffering. And I hope that you find useful ways in your escapes, whether that useful way is exercise or music or reading or going to the movies or whatever your useful way is of escaping. And that you don't do what Sonny did early in his life and turn to something like heroin to get through it. So I didn't want to turn that into a lecture, but it's kind of inevitable when you talk about this story. So that's it. I hope that you've enjoyed Sonny's Blues, and I hope that you can get something out of it.